We use the acronyms AM and PM when telling time so frequently that it is easy to forget exactly what they mean. Almost everyone knows that AM or antemeridium refers to a time between midnight and noon, while PM or postmeridium to a time between noon and midnight. Ante and post are Latin words for before and after. Meridium translates to south. In the northern hemisphere, where the Egyptians began using this terminology, the sun is farthest south in the sky at midday, so 1 p.m. could be interpreted as 1 hour after the sun is farthest south. Except that, depending on where you live and the time of the year, that conjecture may be very far from reality. In the town of Severna Park, Maryland, on the 2nd of December 2022, when this podcast is releasing, the sun comes up at 7:07 a.m. and sets at 4:44 p.m. The time when the sun is farthest south, or solar noon, as this phenomenon is commonly called, is 11:55 a.m. on this day. Not perfect, but quite close to when both hands on the clock point towards 12. However, just 1 month ago on the 2nd of November, solar noon in Severna Park was 12:49 p.m. In mid-March, 1:16 p.m. What is going on, and why can't clocks, the sun, and the ancient Egyptians all agree on what time it is? A couple of centuries ago, these discrepancies did not exist. Towns and cities across the U.S. set their clocks to noon when the sun was highest in the sky. Think of high noon from the days of the Wild West. This system, however, created an entirely different type of trouble. Since the sun cannot be everywhere at once, when it was 9 a.m. in Detroit, it was 9:05 in Cleveland, 9:24 in D.C., 9:36 in New York, and 9:48 in Boston. If you find it annoying trying to call your friends who live on the opposite coast of the country because they are always 3 hours ahead or behind you, imagine trying to coordinate any type of event across long distances in this mess. Back in the early 1800s, transportation was slow and communication was limited. Traveling far enough to notice a significant difference in time took days, if not weeks. Having more than 100 different times in the United States was not a major issue. Then, throughout the 19th century, railroads gained popularity, and mass confusion arose as travelers attempted to keep their clocks synced with constantly changing local times. In 1883, the largest railroad company started to operate on the 4 time zones that the continental U.S. uses today. Along with the invention of time zones, standard time was born. No longer did clocks match exactly with the sun, though the misalignment was generally no more than 30 minutes. So the advent of railway time does not quite explain Severna Park's 1:16 p.m. solar noon. Fast forward 12 years. Imagine that you are an entomologist, someone who studies insects as a career, who lives in New Zealand. You love collecting bugs in your spare time, but you have a problem. It gets dark too soon after you finish work. How do you give yourself more time to collect bugs? If you mention lobbying the government to have everyone wake up, go to work, eat lunch, come home from work, and go to bed 1 hour earlier, you would actually be wrong. George Hudson, an entomologist from New Zealand, wanted everyone to shift their daily routines 2 hours earlier, although the government of New Zealand decided that a 1 hour adjustment would be enough. Thus, in 1927, daylight saving time, which involved setting the time 1 hour ahead in the spring, then an hour back in the fall, was used for the first time in the country, though only after an experiment during the First World War in Europe. In 1916, Germany was searching for any possible way to conserve energy to dedicate more resources to the war effort. In the spring and summer months, the sun was rising very early throughout Germany. In Berlin in June, the sun would cross over the horizon as early as 3:43 a.m., when nearly everyone was still sleeping. By setting clocks 1 hour later, the times of sunrise and sunset would appear to be delayed by 1 hour. There would be more daylight when people tend to be awake, and in the days when coal was used as a primary source of fuel, and artificial lighting was one of the largest consumers of energy, this adjustment was a valid and largely successful way to save energy. In modern times, when nearly everyone uses electricity during the day and night for a vast array of purposes, the merits of such a practice are far more debatable. Research from recent decades has indicated that the impacts of daylight saving time, or DST as often abbreviated, on energy usage are negligible, with many studies suggesting that springing forward can cause a slight increase in energy consumption compared to falling back. This effect is largely because air conditioners are running for longer in homes during extended afternoons and evenings throughout the warmer months. While DST changes may not affect how we use energy to a great degree, changing the clocks can significantly affect our health. Not only does each time change feel like a guaranteed way to experience jet lag without traveling anywhere, but there are also chronic effects associated with clock change. Chronobiologists, people who study biological rhythms, argue that the skewed balance of daylight towards the evening during DST, as indicated by Severna Park solar noon times near 1 p.m., disrupt the body's internal clock. In the fall and winter, days are short. Light in the morning, which is already limited during this time of the year, is necessary for humans to wake up most naturally. In the spring and summer, when DST is traditionally observed, we are prone to experiencing the opposite problem. Depending on the time of the day, humans secrete different hormones that control the sleep-wake cycle. Being exposed to sunlight too late in the evening delays the production of these hormones and therefore sleep. In fact, it is estimated that an extra hour of natural light in the evening causes people to sleep, on average, 19 minutes less per night. When compounded every night for months on end, this statistic can make a person more susceptible to a slew of health issues including cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and obesity. So why do we still engage in this biannual tampering with time? Public polling reveals a consensus that the majority of Americans wish to end clock changes forever, but the question that apparently remains impossible for lawmakers to answer is whether to spring forward one last time and keep DST permanently, or to make a November time change a last and keep permanent standard time. From a public health standpoint, the latter option is by far the most prudent, though many individuals and companies would still prefer to extend daylight saving time into the late fall and winter. To speak more about the forces driving this debate, JP is joining me on this podcast. JP founded the nonprofit organization Save Standard Time with an intent to raise public awareness about the hazards of permanently switching to DST and to encourage legislators to file bills for permanent standard time instead. So thank you for joining me today. Could you tell me maybe a little bit about what first motivated you to start the nonprofit Save Standard Time?
Yes, and thank you for having me. And if it hasn't been said yet, my name is JP, and I'm the president and founder of the nonprofit Safe Standard Time. We are a 501c4 operating across North America, most especially in the United States, working to support, preserve, and extend the observation of standard time being the actual time defined by the sun. And we reject bills for permanent daylight time being a false clock that's designed to force early waking. I come to this with a background in software engineering, amateur astronomy. I come from a family of farmers. I'm from rural Iowa, and I was taught by my great grandparents to tell the time from where the sun is in the sky. So I have this appreciation of knowing that time is not an arbitrary thing. It's not a human construct. It's a measurement of objective reality. And standard time is really the best way to do that on a global scale. This appreciation, as I said, came to me from my background from family farming, and then also in amateur astronomy, which of course is measuring the position of the heavenly bodies, including the sun in the sky. And then also in software engineering, it'd be so much simpler if everyone was on standard time. I could do time zone conversions in my head if everybody was on standard time, but because people, different nations observe the wrong time zones and they change time zones, it makes everything needlessly confusing. And then that equates to expensive engineering hours that are lost. I founded nonprofit in 2019. In 2018, these bills for permanent daylight time started to break onto the national scene. And in Florida, there was a proposition in California where I was living at the time, and people started to ask me, they said, "Hey, this is a thing that you're interested in. Are these good or bad bills?" And I looked at them and I was not pleased. They were bad bills. And as I watched these unfold, the votes, the legislatures, they were debating these, but they weren't really debating it. They were just making jokes about it. And there was so much confusion. They were talking about farmers and letting people sleep in, but they're doing the exact opposite of what they're talking about. And I didn't see enough people stepping forward to stop it and turn it around. So I decided I had to do it. And so I registered the domain name and the Twitter handle and started writing letters, and it just caught on really quickly, and here we are.
Well, it certainly seems like you've done a lot of work since the early days of SST or Save Standard Time, um, to promote this cause to extend the observation of standard time, as I know you just said, and as I've also seen written like in the footer of the website. So, I was wondering maybe you could tell me which lobbies or which industries are favor DST or standard time the most, from your experiences doing just contacting legislators, um, or I guess trying to seek endorsements from other entities.
Right. So as I got started in this work, I was very pleased to see that there were advocates for public health on the side of Standard Time. The circadian health community, sleep doctors, also advocates for schools and for safety. They are very supportive of permanent Standard Time, and I'm eternally grateful for their collaborations and the contributions in this field. I was also very pleased to see religious leaders coming forward, some from the Christian communities, but also more especially from the Jewish community, and some from Muslims communities. They on the Christian side, Standard Time is said to be God's time, which it is defined from nature, so that makes sense. But then also for Jews and Muslims, they have prayers every day and night that are tied to the movements of the sun, and being on daylight time puts an undue burden on their worship. So they have been opposed to extending daylight time into the winter. So I've been pleased for their support as well, and their contributions that came before I even got involved. On the side of daylight time, as I got involved, I quickly learned that the groups and individuals that were testifying either in writing or orally for these daylight bills were mostly from golf associations, from travel, tourism, from convenience stores, and from energy companies. And the reasons for that is because when we're on daylight time, we are forcing ourselves to wake up earlier in the morning, and it tends to keep us up later in the evening. So for one, we are not sleeping as much, we're awake more, and that leads to bad decision-making and increased spending, especially in the evenings. So that's why the golf lobbyists, they believe that they sell more rounds of golf in the evening if we're on daylight time. The convenience shops feel that they're going to sell more Cheetos and Slurpees and tanks of gasoline. And the tourism, certain airlines think that it'll be good for business as well, and travel. And there are some industries that are not non-for-profit that do support Standard Time. That would usually be the skiing industry, AM radio, and farmers. The reasons for those are the best skiing is in the morning when the snow is still fluffy. As I'm told, I'm from Iowa, so I don't actually ski very much. But if you have daylight time, the morning is dark and you have to wait to go skiing. If we had daylight time in the winter, you'd have to wait until maybe 9 o'clock in December or 9 o'clock in the morning in January to go skiing. And that's not good for the skiing business. So they have come out in opposition to permanent daylight saving time bills. AM radio is another interesting one. Because of the physics of radio, your broadcast travels further in the nighttime, so you have to power down. Something like this. I'm paraphrasing. It's not my wheelhouse. But essentially, if we were on permanent daylight time and we delayed the sunrise until 9 o'clock in the morning, then the AM radio broadcast would not be able to go out until most people were already starting work, and that would eat into their half of their audience. So we see lobbyists for AM broadcast radio coming out against daylight bills. And what was the last one I mentioned? And farmers, anybody who works outdoors, usually works outdoors in the morning when it's cooler. And when you darken the morning with permanent daylight time, then they either have to work in the dark, which they don't want to do, or if they have to work later and overlap with rush hour, and they don't want to do that either. So farmers, ranchers, construction workers, they generally would be against permanent daylight saving time as well.
Well, it sounds like there's a lot of economic interests that go into this. So I'm wondering, have you found that the overall economic effect is better with standard time through some of the research you've done?
Yes, and to be clear, I am not a professional scientist. I do rely on the scientists in my address book to help me through this. But there's a lot of research showing that when we're on permanent daylight time, or even when we're on just seasonal daylight saving time, summer observation of daylight saving time, we are sleeping less, and we have a circadian misalignment, and these two things lead to decreased performance in the workplace. Productivity is lower. Your decision-making ability is less strong, and that leads to less earnings for your business, and also less individual earnings. It's been found very likely to decrease wages and salaries. So it might benefit these few niche interests, but for the overall economy, it would be harmful. It is harmful to be on seasonal daylight time, and it would be much more harmful to be on permanent daylight time. If we could switch to permanent standard time, that would benefit the general population and the general economy.
So even with all of this research suggesting that the overall effects of a bill for permanent daylight saving time would be far more negative and all the downsides would outweigh the benefits, just this year on the 15th of March, the Senate passed the Sunshine Protection Act, which would make DST permanent except in a couple of states, namely Arizona and Hawaii, that already use permanent standard time. So, how does this act pass, and how likely is it that an act or this act or an act similar to this one will be successful in the near future?
Yes, so the Sunshine Protection Act is a bill from Senator Marco Rubio, Republican from Florida, that, if I recall correctly, he's introduced to the Congress for the last 4 years, and it's gone nowhere every single year. But then this year he did get a leap forward. I think it was the Tuesday after the clock sprung forward. It was definitely the Ides of March. He called for a voice consent vote, and there were a couple problems with that. First, you usually don't do a voice consent vote on a matter that is not very important. Or you don't do it on matters that are important. You would do it on smaller matters, and I hesitate to say trivial, but because every issue matters to somebody. But daylight saving time, this literally kills people. So it's not something you want to decide lightly. You want to have a rigorous debate. You want to consult expert testimony. You want to have analysis of the data and the history. So it's not appropriate to call for a voice consent vote. And the other problem was that it was unannounced. When you do a voice consent vote, as I understand, it's supposed to be put on the calendar so people know. And so it was like several senators were not even in the room because they didn't know what was happening. And most of those in the room didn't know it was happening even when it was happening. It was such a strange breach of conduct. And if you watch the video, it's rather shocking that they call for the voice consent and they look around and no one seems to know what's happening. And then the chair says yes, and she pumps her fist and declares it to be a victory.
I want to briefly interrupt this interview to share an audio clip from the Senate floor on the day the Sunshine Protection Act was passed.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Madam President. And
What you just heard was Senator Kirsten Sinema's reaction when nobody objected to the act. It is mind-boggling that such a bill is passed without any type of debate or vote. Just by listening to the reaction, it almost feels like the Sunshine Protection Act is a part of some machination.
And it was a shock. It caused a lot. It created a lot of headlines. So it was kind of good news, bad news, because it was bad news for the bill to pass out of the Senate. But the good news was it got everybody's attention. And from that point forward, a lot of the media coverage improved greatly in quality, because prior to that, we were seeing a lot of people talking about, hooray, we're going to end clock change. And then after that, they were talking about Did we pick the right clock? We've done this before and it didn't work the last time. So thankfully, when it transmitted over to the House, because we do have a bicameral legislature, the Senate and the House have to agree to something. So it passed the Senate, but it stalled in the House. And our group and several other groups were very active in slowing its pace to a stall in the House. It is set to expire by the end of this year, by the end of next month, by the end of December 2022. And that looks to be exactly what's going to happen. So that's a good thing. We do want this bill to expire. I feel very certain that Senator Rubio will introduce it for the 5th time in a row next year, but we're working hard to get a bill for permanent standard time instead. Most of the legislators that support these bills for permanent daylight time, they don't know the difference between the two clocks. They just want to end the clock change. So we need to give them the opportunity to make the right decision. If all they want to do is end clock change, they can do that with permanent standard time, and it's much safer, healthier, better for the economy, better for civil liberties, even better for energy and the environment. It's just the right thing to do.
Standard time is federally pre-approved by the Uniform Time Act passed back in 1966. So and even despite, again, all this media coverage suggesting that perhaps the Senate did not pick the right time, there still seems to be, and with all this push for permanent DST, are lawmakers interested in perhaps the easier, safest, and overall perhaps this better route of going for permanent standard time? Or does that not seem to be consensus among a lot of lawmakers yet?
So yes, the Uniform Time Act of 1966 was written such that, well, we already had federal law saying that you're supposed to be in your right time zone. The Standard Time Act, the Calder Act of 1918. But it was, okay, so I'm getting mixed up. I'm getting out of, I'll try to start over. In 1918, the Calder Act was passed, formalizing the standard time zones of the United States. They already effectively were in place prior to that from 1883 or 84 by private industry, by the railroads. But again, the standard time zones were also designed from solar time. And there was a whole agreement over globally as to define the 24 standard time zones, one for each hour around the globe. It's a beautiful, simple, pure system. And so it was formalized in 1918. Then during World War I and II, we started to play with this daylight time business. And it was originally proposed as a way to increase leisure after work, specifically to go play golf. And that did not sell. People thought that's a silly idea, and they were right. It was a silly idea. But then when war broke out, they said maybe it would save energy by forcing people to wake up earlier, they go to bed earlier, maybe they won't run the lights at night, we'll save coal and oil for the war effort. So that was the excuse they invented. There was really no data behind that hypothesis. But Germany did it, England did it, and then everybody else in the Western world quickly followed suit, including the United States a year later. And so we started to do this daylight saving time, and it was promoted in editorials by big business, by retail, by shopping malls. They were paying for these adverts. It was always a money-making scheme, but it was cloaked in this patriotism and energy-saving idea. But after the war, we got rid of it because it was a war effort. It was a war rationing tactic. But then the lobbyists tried to bring it back in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, city by city, county by county, state by state in the United States. And they slowly convinced more and more communities to do daylight saving time in the summer only. And we had a patchwork problem where nobody knew what time it was when you travel between cities and states across the United States. And that was disruptive to commerce and transportation. So in 1966, Congress drafted the Uniform Time Act and said, okay, the Department of Transportation will be in charge. You need to remember to keep on your right time zone, but if you want to do daylight time, fine. Everybody has to do it on these specific dates You got to be in sync. And if you want to opt out entirely, you can. So Hawaii opted out right away. The territories opted out right away. I think Michigan and Indiana opted out quickly. Arizona did not pass a bill quickly enough, so they had to do daylight time for one summer, and they hated it so much that they very quickly passed a bill the next year to get rid of it, to opt out. It was found to dramatically increase air conditioning costs in Arizona. Having that extra hour in the evening means more heat when you don't want it, so more energy costs, more electricity spent on air conditioning. So the way the bill was written was really, you got to be on standard time by default. If you want to do daylight time, you can. But it put everybody on this schedule of daylight time by default. You have to opt out of it. You can't opt in. It's kind of like junk mail. It's hard to opt out of junk mail. You've got to make that effort. So only a few states have actually made the effort. And some of the states that made the effort got pressured back into doing it. Michigan now, Indiana recently in 2006 or 7, around there, started observing daylight time. And it's really been an economic pressure. If your neighboring state is doing this daylight saving time game, then you feel pressure to do it as well. So when we are proposing bills for permanent standard time, what we're doing is we're strongly recommending that you include a clause that says we will opt out of daylight saving time when our neighboring state of X, Y, and Z do the same. So if you're in Maryland, I would suggest that your legislature pass a bill that says we intend to opt out of daylight saving time once Delaware, Pennsylvania, and Virginia do the same, for example. And then you can pass the bill. It becomes a law, but it doesn't actually go into effect until your neighboring states do the same thing. And that can encourage the other states to follow suit. And it prevents this fear of going out of sync, because yeah, it would be disruptive if, if it were 4 o'clock in Baltimore, but 5 o'clock in DC, and 5 o'clock up in Harrisburg. That'd be kind of weird. The thing with the permanent daylight bills is because they are federally prohibited, they're actually easier to pass because they can't put them into effect. And so if you want to, as a legislator, pass a bill that has no effect whatsoever, but still counts as a win on your record as a bill that you introduced and passed, that's an easy path forward as a legislator. And so that's kind of an unfortunate reality we ended up with. Starting in 2018, Florida passed the first permanent daylight saving time bill. Has no effect. It's federally illegal. But what it did was cascaded to neighboring states doing the same thing. And so now we have the situation where we have 17 states that have passed bills stating intention to go to permanent daylight saving time if Congress were to change federal law to permit such. Another challenge was that the lobbyists for daylight saving time got involved a lot sooner. They've been working on this since about 2014, whereas I only started to see activism for standard time in 2018, and myself only got involved in 2019. So the daylight crowd has 4 years ahead of us, and so they made a lot of more progress in the meantime as well. But in the last 2 years, we've been very good about slowing and stopping more and more of their bills and drawing more media attention and public awareness. And we've seen an increase of bills for standard time in the last few years as well.
So I know you mentioned how all the way back in the 1800s, when time zones were first established after, no one knew what time it was going between cities. And I mean no one, because each city literally just observed the time of when the sun was overhead at noon.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess one thing that is stood out to me is that many of these time zone borders, especially I noticed between like the Eastern and Central time zone, have shifted significantly farther west since the 1800s. So have maybe some of the lobbyists that have pushed for GST and more evening light have they had anything to do with this, or has there been another force driving the time zones?
I don't know how much it has been lobbied against. It's possible. I haven't done my research into into that, but I know that. So, as an amateur astronomer, one of my hobbies is to visit observatories. And when I was in Cincinnati, I went to their observatory, and they were telling me how they used to be on, of course, solar time, local solar time, and then they moved to Central Standard Time, and then there's a big debate as to there was pressure to move to Eastern Time, and a lot of that it has to do with just the markets. The New York Stock Exchange is a strong factor in commerce, and there's the Chicago market as well, but it's hard to compete with the New York market. So when you're in when you're in Western Ohio and you're kind of in the middle of like Chicago, New York, it was like scientifically they should be on Central Time, but there is that socioeconomic pull to be more in line with New York City. So the markets play a strong role. Business plays a strong role. I mean, also just the lay of the land. The United States was settled east to west, so it's more densely populated. There are more people on the east coast of the continent than on the west coast. All of these play as roles. In the western edge of the Central Time Zone has a similar situation, where, for example, we see Western Texas really should be on Mountain Time, but they wanted to keep more in sync with Dallas and Houston, which are on Central Time, rather than Denver, which feels so very far away. Up in North Dakota and South Dakota, I conjecture that they felt closer socially and economically to Chicago than to Denver. I've seen a lot of these discussions, but I don't know that I can cite any specifically lobbyists getting involved. And a lot of these decisions were either made by legislators or more often by governors. I think it was the governor of Indiana who convinced them to change to Eastern Time and get on daylight time, and they're making these decisions with money in mind first, and I can't necessarily blame them for that. Money is important, and if you don't know that there is a health cost or a scientific connection or a history behind these things, then it's a forgivable mistake.
Well, thank you very much for explaining all of that, and that concludes the questions I have for you. And but thank you very much for your time today.
Oh, well, you're very welcome. It's always a pleasure to talk about this topic for me.
One major theme that I am noticing is that a person's geographic location further complicates this issue. Near the western fringes of time zones, the sun rises and sets noticeably later than farther east without messing with the clocks. Even near the eastern borders of time zones, standard time is still better than daylight saving time for keeping clock time in sync with both nature and biology. However, being located west in a time zone amplifies the undesirable effects of DST rather than counteracting them. For some additional insights on this complication, I am also joined by Diane Shackelford, a member of the board of directors at Save Standard Time, who lives near the western border of the eastern time zone.
Could you tell me what first drew you to Save Standard Time and where you were calling in from?
Yes, hi. I'm calling in from Georgia, in Atlanta area. What first drew me to Save Standard Time was really I started to realize when I moved to Georgia 20 years ago, I started realizing, gosh, the sunrise is really late here, and the kids are going out to the bus in the dark in the fall, and I didn't like that. And then later when they extended it, it got even worse. It was more of the year. And later on, I guess years down the line, maybe 2019, I started complaining about it, maybe on Facebook or something, and then because you'll find people that kind of commiserate with you. And that's all I really was doing at first. But I encountered a couple of different people. I encountered the Lock the Clock people, conversed with him a little bit, and I kind of realized he was like for the opposite thing, even though he didn't really say that. It was apparent. And then I also encountered JP, and his entity was Safe Standard Time. And, we conversed a little bit online, and then eventually through private messages, direct messages, just strategizing on, how to advocate and, how to best affect the movement, because there really was a movement starting at this point. So that was really it. When Jay decided he wanted to incorporate, then I kind of volunteered because he needed some board members. So I volunteered at that point, and ever since I've been completely immersed in this issue.
Well, it sounds like you've been doing a lot in terms of advocacy, and so I don't know, were there any experiences in particular that you wanted to talk about, or anything that has stood out to you in the past few years with the organization?
Sure. Well, I mean, as far as the advocacy, a lot of that is online, social media, things like that. But there's also a lot of letter writing and meeting with legislators, testifying at hearings and things like that, trying to get states and the federal government also to pass laws in favor of permanent standard time. A lot of the states seem to be filing bills for permanent DST. So I did have quite the experience with Georgia in particular. That is, some states make it very easy for you to find out when everything is happening and to participate, and then others do not. And Georgia kind of falls in the latter category there. So they had filed two different bills. It was HB 44 and SB 100. SB 100 originally said that it would put Georgia on standard time year-round until the federal government allowed permanent daylight savings time, and then they would switch to daylight savings time. And HB 44 just left out the standard time part and said Georgia will go on year-round DST when the federal government allows. And so they were like that, and each of them passed their own branch of the government in that original form, right? So then I tried to get involved, and I tried to testify against HB 44 and SB 100 both when they were in their committees in the opposite houses. And I had the worst time. All of Georgia's agendas would say TBD. So you never knew what they were going to cover. And so you had to call, and then they wouldn't know till the day before. And they would say, well, they'll post it 24 hours ahead. Well, they didn't. So when I got the word that I could testify for SB 100, I got on the call. It was a Zoom call. I waited. I wrote out a whole thing. Like, I was very nervous. I'd never done it before. Wrote out a whole thing. Sat on their Zoom call for 75 minutes through two other bills and other speakers for those bills. And then they didn't call my name. And they went straight to a vote. And I tried to object, I'm supposed to speak. And they're like, they didn't hear me at all. And they voted it through. And I was very upset by that. And then I emailed about that and complained about it. Nobody ever responded. So I didn't feel good about the transparency at all. The same thing kind of happened when I tried to testify against HB 44 in the other branch. I got a hold of an administrative assistant, and she said, oh, it'll post, 24 hours ahead. Well, it didn't. But she did email me the day before when the hearing, and she said, oh, it's going to be tomorrow at 8 a.m. Well, that was 2:00 in the afternoon the day before. And I said, well, when's the deadline, for written testimony? She said 5:00 today. I'm like, so I had 3 hours and I was working. And so I scrambled that together. I said, put me on the list to testify. And she responded back a couple hours later that they weren't going to allow virtual testimony, with no explanation, even though they'd always done it before. So I didn't get to testify at that one either, because I couldn't just drop everything and go to Atlanta with that such short notice, So anyway, they swapped language in the bills. When they went to the opposite houses, they flip-flopped the language. for each of the bills to what the other one was. And then they passed them through the same chambers that had passed that wording originally. And that's how they got permanent standard time passed in Georgia. I mean, permanent DST, not permanent standard time. They passed permanent DST in Georgia, which they can't enact, obviously, until the federal legislation, when and if the federal legislation goes through. So not the best experience in Georgia. I did also testify in Maryland. I think maybe twice. I'm not quite sure. I'm remembering that right now. Much better experience there. I don't know that it was effective, but as far as like getting notified and signing up and being able to participate, a much better experience. It's all very public. There's like not that shady sort of feeling behind it, like they're trying to keep you out of it.
It certainly does appear that Maryland's most recent bill for permanent DST was in fact killed. So I guess we could thank some of the loopholes you jumped through in Georgia to carrying over into Maryland in that regard. But Maryland is almost lucky in the sense that it's in the almost just like right in the right spot to be observing Eastern time.
Yes.
Whereas parts of Georgia should not be on Eastern time, they should be on Central time. So
That's true. Yes.
would you like to maybe talk a little bit more about how your experience has been living farther west, or maybe just like how those late evenings and darkness late into the morning can affect you?
Sure.
Or your family, or just in general?
Yeah. I mean, so I can really have a dual view on this because I grew up in California. Sunrises where I lived there and sunsets were probably 45 minutes to an hour almost earlier than they are here. So it was quite a shock to me, like when we moved here in the year 2000, when it would be past 7 a.m. in October and pitch dark outside. I just didn't even realize that there was like that disparity from one location to another at that point. You know, I don't know, I was in my 30s at that point. And it just had never been an issue for me because we had early sunrises and sunsets either way in California, regardless of which you know, if we were on DST or standard time. It just never had been an issue at that point in my life. But it became an issue here when I was having to have my kids out at the bus stop a quarter mile up the road and it was pitch dark outside. And also I find that just like trying to wake up when nobody likes to wake up in the dark. I mean, I've never liked to wake up in the dark, you know, and when you have to do that, like day after day after day, it just it's draining, it's exhausting. And like, you just dread the alarm clock going off. If you wake up and it's light outside, you have like this panic moment where you're like, oh my God, I'm late, you know, for something. So I don't like that. And then I find that in the summer, like in the evenings, the summers are light for so long, past 9 o'clock in the longest days of summer, that you can't even get your kids to bed because it's like before sunset, like 8 o'clock. Sunset is like 8:40 something, I think, in the summer. So somewhere after 8:30, I'm not quite sure. But you can't get them to bed because they're like, it's still light out. I don't want to go to bed. And that's like the best part of the day when it's so hot in the summer. Like the best time to be outside is after sunset. And you're like taking that away from all the kids because they have to go to bed. So, you know, there's that. And then there's like the fireworks. Like we can't even shoot off fireworks until almost 10 o'clock because it's not dark enough to really see them in the sky well. So, you know, there's no need for it to be light past bedtime and dark when you wake up. And that's really been the driving force behind my original position on this. Of course, I know there's a lot of health aspects that support my preference, but it did start out for me as a preference, and then I started finding other data. So,
well, it certainly sounds like those later sunrises and later sunsets are not doing well for you, or or
Yeah.
your children. And I can certainly relate to having it be sweltering hot out at 9 p.m. and it's
Yeah.
still just got dark, or maybe it's still getting dark.
Yeah. And you have to go in and get ready for bed.
Mhm. And
Yeah.
I can tell you, I almost never got to bed on time as a child for that exact reason.
Yeah. Definitely can understand that. It was tough around here too. The kids just stayed up later, but then they had to get up and it was not pleasant.
And so, what time of year do schools start in Georgia? Does that tend to be an issue as well, or is that
It is an issue. It starts in early August, which I found odd
yikes?
because in California it was September, early September. So that creates more issues around with this scenario because literally in August, the sunset is after bedtime and the sunrise is after the bus leaves. So you're putting your kids to bed before sunset and you're waking them up in the dark and putting them on a bus before sunrise in August because of DST. So yeah, it's definitely an issue. If it would be a little bit better if they pushed it back into September, but then the mornings, the mornings get dark later and the sunrise gets later and later until you get into November when we flip times again. So, by October it's dark again.
It seems like there really just isn't a good solution, especially with school start times being as early as they can be in some places. Um,
Yes. Yes. And they have worked on that. Some of the schools have pushed their start times back, but you still have to account. I don't think a lot of people realize you have to account for bus routes that can at least an hour on either end of the school day for bus routes. And the fact that the buses do multiple rounds, like we use the same buses for the elementary and then the middle and high school. So there's some challenges with that for sure.
well, it sounds like you've had a lot of examples, both
Yeah.
from personal experience and of course, from researching the health and your personal experience. You seem to support the health, later sunrises, later sunsets. I want to say it's like 19 minutes less sleep per night that you get if you're um, with having an extra hour of natural light shifted from the morning to the evening. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. And
so,
I feel I do.
it,
I have a sleep tracker. I don't know if I mentioned this to you before. I have a sleep tracker, the Fitbit, right? And my sleep scores, when we switched back to standard time in November, my sleep scores went up like 10 to 15 points consistently. So I was like, it does make a difference because I'm ready to go to bed earlier. I fall asleep easier and then I wake up more naturally. So I feel better rested when I have an earlier sunrise and an earlier sunset. So.
well, thank you very much for joining me, and it was a pleasure to hear about all the hoops you've tried to jump through and all of the thoughts you have to share about DST and time changes and how those are impacting you and some of the work you've been doing. Thank you.
No, you're welcome.
Diane mentioned the need for school children to catch a bus before sunrise and, in some cases, go to bed before sunset. An issue that is often discussed along with daylight saving time is school start times. The American Academy of Pediatrics recommends that middle and high schools start no earlier than 8:30 a.m., as these students naturally tend to go to bed later in the night and wake up later in the morning. Despite this knowledge, the vast majority of secondary schools start before this time. Permanent DST, which would delay sunrise past 8 a.m. for months in most regions of the United States, already presents safety concerns, especially for students, many of whom would be commuting to school in the dark despite leaving school long before sunset. In addition, our internal clocks cannot be fooled as easily as a wristwatch. Even if the start time for all schools was suddenly moved to 8:30, anytime DST is in effect, school still starts at 7:30 circadian time. An 8 o'clock start time becomes 7 o'clock. Schools that officially start in the 7 o'clock hour start in the 6 o'clock hour in the time that governs our bodies. As such, leaders of the movement for later school start times are frequently outspoken opponents of extending daylight saving time. Everyone loves fun in the evenings, and some types of fun require daylight, although fleeting amusement in the sun should not come at the expense of health. Standard time offers a roughly equal amount of daylight before noon and afternoon, which not only keeps clocks honest, but is also best for public health. It may not seem true on the day we fall back, when sunshine is seemingly gone, not long after you eat lunch, but Standard Time would still offer daylight until 7:34 p.m. on the summer solstice in Savannah Park, Maryland. Plenty late for us all to enjoy barbecues and swimming pools without impeding on the clock of nature. Moreover, our leisure does not need to end when the sun disappears from the sky, especially on the short days of autumn and winter. The next time that you start to feel bummed about darkness at 5 p.m. in December, consider driving around to see some holiday lights while enjoying some hot chocolate. It will probably be too cold outside to be golfing anyway. Thank you for listening, and a special thank you to JP and Diane Shackelford of Save Standard Time for the time and thought that they invested in creating this podcast.